He's not stupid. Ethan once heard his third-grade teacher whisper to his mother, "He just thinks differently." But at the Whitmore dinner table, different meant dumb, and that label followed him for 38 years until a $47 million check landed on the polished oak surface and no one laughed anymore. It was a Sunday night in late October when the family gathered at Richard and Diane Whitmore's colonial home in Westport, Connecticut, the kind with white shutters, a 3-car garage, and a dining room reserved for occasions that required crystal glasses and subtle judgment. Lucas arrived first, as he always did, confident and loud, his tailored blazer tossed over the back of his chair as if the room already belonged to him. Richard clapped him on the shoulder, asking about quarterly bonuses and market forecasts, while Diane refilled his wine before his glass dipped below half. Ethan came in quietly 10 minutes later, wearing a navy sweater and the same calm expression he had perfected since childhood. No one asked about his drive. No one asked about his work. Richard gestured toward the empty chair at the far end of the table and said with a half-smile, "There's our dreamer, still trying to invent the next big thing in the garage." Lucas chuckled. Diane shook her head in theatrical disappointment. It was familiar choreography. For years, they had introduced Lucas as the smart one and Ethan as the creative one, which in their language meant unreliable. When Ethan was 8, he took apart a kitchen clock just to see how the gears fit together. Richard called it destructive curiosity. When he was 16, he built a basic scheduling app for a school project. Diane told relatives it was cute, but reminded them Lucas had scored higher on the SAT. Even at his college graduation, when Ethan earned a degree in computer engineering, Richard's toast somehow pivoted to Lucas's internship at an investment bank in Manhattan. The pattern never shifted. Ethan learned to fold his napkin neatly, to nod, to let the laughter pass over him like background noise. That night, roasted chicken and rosemary potatoes were served on fine china, and the conversation revolved around Lucas's upcoming promotion. Ethan listened, hands loosely clasped, eyes steady. When Richard finally turned to him, it wasn't with curiosity, but with routine amusement. "So tell us, Ethan," he said, leaning back in his chair, "you figured out how to make that little tech hobby of yours pay the bills yet? Or are you still the dumb one betting on fairy tales?" The word hung in the air. Dumb one. Lucas smirked. Diane's lips tightened in that polite smile she used when she believed she was being practical rather than cruel. Ethan didn't flinch. He reached beside his chair and lifted a simple manila envelope onto the table. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't demand attention. He placed it between the salt shaker and the candle, then slid it gently toward his father. "I think this covers the fairy tales," he said, his voice even, almost soft. Richard laughed at first, assuming it was a joke, some clever comeback meant to save face. But when he opened the envelope and unfolded the document inside, the laughter thinned. The number printed in bold black ink was precise, unmistakable, and followed by more zeros than anyone at that table had ever seen in one place. $47 million. The room went quiet in a way it never had before, as if the house itself had paused to listen. Richard read the number once, then again, as if an extra zero might disappear under closer inspection, but it did not move and it did not shrink, and the silence around the dining table felt heavier than any joke he had ever told at his younger son's expense. Diane leaned forward first, her hand hovering near the paper without touching it, as though the ink might smear if she moved too quickly. Lucas stopped smiling. The confidence that usually filled the room when he spoke seemed to drain into the hardwood floor beneath him. Ethan remained still, hands folded lightly in front of him, posture straight, not defensive, not triumphant. He had imagined this moment more than once over the years, but in those private versions there had been raised voices, dramatic speeches, maybe even apologies rehearsed in advance. Instead, what he felt now was steady and quiet, like a long exhale after holding his breath for decades. Richard cleared his throat. He adjusted his glasses. "This is some kind of offer letter," he said, attempting casual dismissal, but the edge in his voice betrayed him. "Acquisition agreement," Ethan corrected gently. "The company was acquired last week." He did not rush the words. He did not emphasize them. He simply stated them as fact. Diane blinked. "Acquired by who?" she asked, her tone shifting from amused skepticism to cautious curiosity. Ethan named a national technology firm headquartered in San Francisco, one that Richard recognized from business headlines and Lucas had referenced during more than one market analysis. The name carried weight. The number on the page carried more. Lucas leaned forward, elbows on the table, reading over his father's shoulder. $47 million, he said slowly, as if translating a foreign language. That is not revenue. That is the valuation. That is the purchase price, Ethan replied. He reached for his water glass and took a sip, the most ordinary gesture in the room. Diane sat back in her chair. For a moment, her eyes searched her son's face, perhaps looking for the boy who had once dismantled kitchen appliances just to understand their wiring. You never told us, she said softly. Ethan nodded. You never asked. The statement was not sharp. It was not accusatory. It was simply accurate. The clock on the wall ticked, marking seconds that felt longer than they should have. Richard folded the document carefully, too carefully, as though precision might restore control. If this is real, he began, then stopped, because the evidence was printed in black and white in his own hands. He looked at Ethan differently now, not with warmth yet, but with recalibration. Lucas leaned back slowly, processing, calculating, measuring what this meant in comparison to his own career trajectory. Ethan watched them without bitterness. He had built his company in a modest office space no larger than 700 square feet, working nights and weekends, eating takeout at a folding desk while investors dismissed him in early meetings. He remembered wiring his own servers, negotiating contracts without a pedigree last name to lean on, learning to read balance sheets because no one had offered to teach him. He remembered every holiday he had skipped to meet development deadlines. Every call home that ended quickly because the conversation drifted back to Lucas's achievements. The check on the table did not erase those years. It did not rewrite them. It simply proved they had mattered. Diane finally spoke again. Ethan, she said carefully, testing the weight of his name as if it were new. We had no idea. He met her gaze, calm and unguarded. I know, he said. And for the first time in that dining room, the quiet did not belong to embarrassment or ridicule. It belonged to recognition. Richard was the first to move, not toward Ethan but toward the decanter, as though a measured pour of red wine might restore the balance of a room that had quietly shifted beneath his feet. He filled his own glass higher than usual, then Diane's, then hesitated before offering one to Ethan. It was a small pause, barely noticeable, yet it carried years of assumption inside it. Ethan declined with a polite shake of his head. Lucas broke the silence next. So what happens now? He asked, his voice carefully neutral, but his eyes alert, calculating angles the way he did in conference rooms in Manhattan. Do you stay on as chief executive officer? Do you roll equity into the parent company? The questions came quickly, structured, familiar territory. Ethan answered calmly. There is a 12-month transition agreement. After that, I am free to step away. Richard studied him as if seeing a stranger across the table. For decades, he had measured success in promotions, corner offices, annual bonuses tied to predictable growth charts. Ethan had built something in silence, without press releases sent to the family group text, without holiday bragging rights. Diane folded her napkin slowly. Why did you not tell us when things started to take off? She asked, not accusatory now, but almost fragile. Ethan considered the question before responding. Because when I tried to explain what I was building, it sounded unrealistic to you, he said. It was easier to wait until it was finished. The statement landed gently but firmly. Lucas leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. You could have at least hinted, he said, a faint edge returning. We might have invested early. Ethan met his brother's eyes without tension. You advised me to get a stable job, he replied. You said startups were statistically irresponsible. Lucas did not argue. The memory was accurate. Richard shifted in his seat. He remembered that conversation as well, remembered telling his younger son that dreaming was not a retirement plan. The irony was not lost on him now. The dining room, once filled with easy superiority, felt recalibrated. The same chandelier cast the same warm light over polished wood and framed family photographs, but the hierarchy embedded in that space had tilted. Diane glanced toward those photographs, images of Lucas in varsity jackets and Ethan in the background, smiling politely. We were trying to protect you, she said quietly. Ethan nodded once. I know, he replied. And he did know. He knew they believed caution was love, that comparison was motivation. But he also knew the cost of carrying a label that never adjusted with growth. Lucas cleared his throat again, shifting from disbelief to opportunity. $47 million changes things, he said, attempting a lighter tone. You are officially the most interesting person at this table. It was meant as humor, but it revealed more than intended. Ethan allowed a faint smile. I was always interesting, he said evenly. You just did not find my direction familiar. Richard exhaled slowly, setting his glass down with care. I may have underestimated you, he admitted, the words stiff but sincere. It was not an apology. Not yet. But it was the first crack in a narrative repeated since childhood. Ethan did not press for more. He did not demand validation retroactively. He simply sat there, steady and composed, understanding that recognition, when it finally arrives, does not need to be loud to be permanent. No one reached for dessert that night. The apple pie Diane had baked that afternoon sat untouched at the center of the table, its golden crust cooling under the chandelier light, while conversation struggled to find a new rhythm. For years, the Whitmore dinners had followed a predictable pattern. Lucas spoke. Richard evaluated. Diane affirmed. Ethan listened. That structure had held steady through holidays, birthdays, and graduations. Now it felt fragile, as if a single misplaced word might fracture it completely. Richard adjusted his posture, leaning forward with his forearms resting on the polished wood. What exactly was the company doing? He asked, his tone measured, no longer teasing. Ethan answered without embellishment. Data infrastructure optimization for mid-sized logistics firms, he said. We built software that reduces inefficiencies in routing and warehouse allocation. It lowers fuel costs, improves delivery times, and increases profit margins by measurable percentages. He spoke plainly, not to impress, but because the explanation no longer required permission. Lucas listened more carefully this time. He asked follow-up questions about recurring revenue and client retention rates. Ethan responded with numbers, not bravado. The precision in his voice carried years of preparation. Diane watched her younger son with an expression she had not worn before. It was not pride yet. It was closer to recalculation, as if she were quietly rewriting a long-held assumption. When did this start? She asked. Ethan thought back. 6 years ago, he said. I began building the prototype in a small office space near Stanford. 700 square feet. 2 desks. 1 borrowed server. Richard's eyebrows lifted slightly. 6 years was not a hobby. 6 years was persistence. Diane's mind drifted, perhaps remembering the evenings when Ethan had declined family gatherings, citing deadlines, and how she had told relatives he was probably overcomplicating something that should have been simple. The memory settled heavily. Lucas broke the quiet again. You built that without outside capital at first? He asked. Ethan nodded. Bootstrap for the first 18 months, he replied. Then a small angel round. After that, performance spoke for itself. The phrase hung in the air. Performance spoke for itself. It was the language Richard respected most, yet he had never thought to apply it to his younger son. He leaned back slowly, studying Ethan not as a boy who needed guidance, but as a man who had executed a strategy successfully. Diane's voice softened. You carried all of that alone? She asked. Ethan did not dramatize his answer. It was my responsibility, he said. No one else believed in it. The statement was not a complaint. It was a timeline. Richard inhaled deeply, the kind of breath taken before acknowledging something uncomfortable. Perhaps we were too focused on conventional paths, he admitted. It was not a full apology. It was closer than he had ever come. Ethan did not press further. He did not list past dismissals or replay old conversations. He simply allowed the new understanding to settle. The house in Westport remained the same photographs on the walls, the same framed awards on Lucas's sideboard shelf. But the narrative that had defined Ethan for decades had shifted quietly and irreversibly. And in the stillness of that dining room, recognition began to replace assumption, not because he demanded it, but because he had earned it without asking. The plates were eventually cleared, though no one quite remembered who stood up first to carry them into the kitchen. The routine motions of rinsing china and stacking silverware felt unusually deliberate, as if each movement required reconsideration. Diane insisted on washing the dishes herself, declining Ethan's offer to help, perhaps out of habit, perhaps because she needed a task to anchor her thoughts. Richard remained at the table, The acquisition agreement folded neatly in front of him, fingertips resting lightly on the paper as though confirming it had not vanished. Lucas hovered nearby, phone in hand but not scrolling, mind visibly racing through scenarios that had not existed an hour earlier. Ethan stood by the window that overlooked the backyard, where the lawn stretched evenly under the porch lights, the same yard where he had once set up a makeshift workbench at age 12 to experiment with old radio parts. He remembered how Richard had told him to clean up the mess because guests were coming and appearances mattered. Tonight, appearances had already shifted beyond repair. Lucas finally spoke, his tone measured, no longer dismissive. "If you are stepping away in 12 months, you will need advisors," he said. "We should discuss wealth management, tax positioning, strategic investments." The word "we" lingered carefully in the air. Ethan turned slightly, not defensive, simply attentive. "I already have a team," he replied. "Legal counsel, financial advisors." It was part of the acquisition process. Lucas nodded, absorbing that information. Richard looked up slowly. "You planned all of this without consulting family," he said, not accusing, but acknowledging a distance he had helped create. Ethan met his father's gaze. "It required focus," he answered, "and clarity." The implication was subtle, yet unmistakable. Focus thrives in environments free from constant doubt. Diane returned to the dining room, drying her hands on a towel. She paused near Ethan, studying him more openly now. "You must have felt alone," she said quietly. Ethan considered the statement before responding. "Not alone," he said. "Just responsible." Responsibility had been his quiet companion for years, guiding decisions when encouragement had been scarce. Richard exhaled, a sound that carried both pride and regret. "I assumed your brother would be the one to build something extraordinary," he admitted. "I measured potential by confidence." Ethan did not smile at that. He simply nodded. Confidence had always belonged to Lucas, loud and polished. Determination had belonged to Ethan, quieter, less visible, but no less steady. Lucas shifted his weight, an unfamiliar humility settling into his posture. "You outperformed every expectation," he said, the words firm this time, not competitive. It was the closest he had come to admiration. Ethan glanced once more at the folded document on the table, then back at his family. The check did not change who he was. It revealed who he had been all along. He moved toward the door to gather his coat, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same composed efficiency that had carried him through years of doubt. As he stepped onto the porch, the cool Connecticut air felt lighter than it had in a long time. Inside the house, 3 people remained at the table, no longer certain how to categorize the youngest Whitmore. Outside, Ethan walked to his car without hurry, understanding that recognition, when earned quietly, does not need applause to endure. The drive back to Stamford took just under 40 minutes, yet it felt shorter than usual, as if the road itself had straightened. Ethan kept both hands steady on the steering wheel, the dashboard clock glowing softly in the dark. He did not turn on the radio. He did not replay every word from the dinner table. Instead, he allowed the silence to settle in a different way than it had in previous years. There had been other drives home from Westport when the quiet felt heavy, filled with comparisons and subtle dismissals that lingered longer than the conversation itself. Tonight, the quiet felt clean. When he pulled into the parking garage beneath his condominium building, he sat for a moment before stepping out, looking at the concrete walls and painted parking lines that had once symbolized modest stability. He remembered when he first moved into this unit 6 years earlier, calculating every expense carefully, choosing a place under 1,000 square feet because it was practical. Back then, the furniture had been secondhand. The desk had been assembled from flat-packed parts on a Sunday afternoon. There had been no applause, no family curiosity, just a quiet commitment to build something that made sense to him. Inside the apartment, the lights came on with a soft click. The living room remained minimal, organized, intentional. On the kitchen counter sat a framed photograph from years ago, taken at a summer barbecue in the Whitmore backyard. Lucas stood in the center, arm draped confidently over Richard's shoulder. Diane smiled brightly. Ethan stood slightly off to the side, hands in his pockets, expression polite. He studied the image for a long moment. The dynamic in that photograph had shaped years of expectation. It no longer defined him. His phone vibrated gently on the counter. A message from Lucas appeared first. "Congratulations. We should talk about strategy this week. A second message followed from Diane. I am proud of you. I wish we had understood sooner. A third arrived from Richard, brief and uncharacteristically direct. I underestimated you. That is on me. Ethan read each message carefully, not rushing to respond. He did not feel anger. He did not feel triumph. What he felt was distance recalibrating into something more honest. He placed the phone down and walked toward his small home office, where a single monitor still displayed charts and transition documents from the acquisition. The numbers on the screen were familiar. They represented contracts signed, milestones achieved, obstacles resolved without applause. He sat in his chair and leaned back slightly, allowing the weight of the evening to settle into perspective. For years, he had been defined by a label that required no evidence. Now evidence had spoken without emotion. The recognition from his family would evolve, perhaps slowly, perhaps imperfectly, but the foundation beneath his confidence no longer depended on their understanding. Outside his window, the lights of the city shimmered quietly against the night sky. Inside, Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, not to escape the past, but to acknowledge that it no longer directed his future. The narrative had shifted, not because he demanded validation, but because he built something too substantial to dismiss. Morning arrived without urgency. Ethan woke before his alarm, sunlight filtering through the blinds and casting narrow lines across the hardwood floor. For a moment, he lay still, listening to the quiet hum of the city below. Nothing about the room had changed overnight. The same neutral walls, the same compact kitchen, the same desk positioned near the window. Yet something internal had shifted, subtle but undeniable. He reached for his phone on the nightstand and saw another message waiting. This one from Diane, sent just after midnight. I kept thinking about the science fair in 7th grade. You won first place. I told everyone it was luck. I was wrong. He read the message twice, not because he needed clarity, but because he needed to measure the distance between then and now. He remembered that science fair clearly. He had built a small prototype that optimized traffic flow patterns using basic algorithms. Richard had attended for 10 minutes before leaving early for one of Lucas's baseball games. Diane had smiled politely, then reminded him that extracurricular activities were important but should not interfere with practical goals. Back then, Ethan had accepted that response as normal. Now he understood it differently. He rose from bed and walked into the kitchen, starting the coffee maker with practiced efficiency. The sound of brewing filled the apartment. He opened his laptop and reviewed transition documents from the acquisition, scanning through clauses and timelines with the same steady attention he had given them for weeks. The deal was complete. The 12-month advisory period would begin next quarter. He had already outlined personal goals beyond that timeline. Investment in emerging technology sectors. A scholarship fund for students pursuing unconventional engineering paths. Quiet initiatives that did not require press conferences. His phone vibrated again. This time it was Richard. If you have time this week, I would like to take you to lunch. Just us. Ethan paused before responding. In all his adult years, his father had rarely requested one-on-one time unless it involved advice or correction. The invitation felt unfamiliar. He typed a simple reply. Thursday works. He did not add emotion to it. He did not attach conditions. He closed the laptop and carried his coffee to the window. The city below moved at its usual pace, commuters walking briskly, delivery trucks idling at red lights. None of them knew what had shifted inside a dining room in Westport the night before. None of them needed to. Ethan reflected not on the number printed on the agreement, but on the quiet discipline that had brought him there. Early mornings, late nights, code written and rewritten, meetings where investors dismissed him before he finished speaking. He had absorbed doubt without allowing it to dictate direction. That skill had become more valuable than any capital infusion. His phone chimed once more. Lucas again. I misjudged you. That is on me. If you ever want to collaborate, I am open. The message was direct, stripped of bravado. Ethan allowed himself a small nod. Recognition was not guaranteed to be perfect. It would likely evolve slowly, with missteps and adjustments. But it had begun. He set the empty mug in the sink and reached for his jacket. Preparing for a meeting downtown. The world outside remained unaware of personal shifts. Traffic lights changed. Elevators rose and fell. Inside Ethan, however, the old label had dissolved completely. It no longer lingered in memory as accusation. It existed only as contrast to what he had built quietly, deliberately, and without permission. Thursday arrived with a clear sky and a mild breeze drifting in from the sound, the kind of early autumn day that made Connecticut look polished and orderly. Ethan drove back to Westport just before noon, not to the house this time, but to a small waterfront restaurant his father had chosen. It was a place Richard favored for business lunches, quiet enough for serious conversation, refined without being extravagant. When Ethan stepped inside, he saw his father already seated by the window, jacket off, sleeves rolled neatly to the forearms, posture straight but not rigid. Richard stood when he approached, an unfamiliar gesture of respect that did not go unnoticed. They shook hands first, then sat across from one another, menus briefly consulted but barely read. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence was different from the one at Sunday dinner. This one felt intentional, not uncertain. Richard cleared his throat softly. "I have been thinking," he began, fingers resting flat on the tablecloth. "About patterns. About how I define competence." Ethan listened without interruption. The waiter arrived, took their orders, and disappeared, leaving behind glasses of water that caught the sunlight. Richard continued. "I rewarded visibility. Assertiveness. The traits that reminded me of myself at that age." He paused, choosing words carefully. "I mistook quiet focus for lack of ambition." Ethan held his gaze steady. "You valued what you recognized," he said calmly. "That is common." Richard nodded once. "It does not make it accurate." The admission was simple, stripped of defensiveness. Ethan did not rush to fill the space. He had learned over years that meaningful shifts required patience. Richard leaned back slightly. "When you were younger, I thought pushing you would toughen you," he said. "Comparisons were supposed to motivate." Ethan's expression remained composed. "They motivated me," he replied. "Just not in the way you expected." The waiter returned with their meals, placing plates down gently. Conversation paused again as utensils were lifted. After a few bites, Richard spoke more directly. "I underestimated your discipline," he said. "That is my responsibility." Ethan did not smile widely. He did not deflect. He simply nodded once. "Thank you," he said, the words measured and sincere. Outside the window, small sailboats moved steadily across the water, guided by wind rather than force. Richard glanced toward them briefly before looking back at his son. "I would like to understand what you built," he said. "Not because of the number, because of the process." It was a subtle but meaningful distinction. Ethan recognized it immediately. He began explaining the early stages of the company, the initial prototypes, the failures that preceded stability. Richard listened without interrupting, without redirecting the focus toward Lucas or market comparisons. He asked questions rooted in curiosity rather than evaluation. The tone of the conversation shifted from correction to exploration. By the time the plates were cleared, something fundamental had changed between them. Not a complete transformation, not an instant rewrite of decades, but a genuine recalibration. As they stood to leave, Richard placed a hand briefly on Ethan's shoulder, firm and steady. "I am proud of what you built," he said quietly. The statement did not erase the past. It did not need to. It acknowledged the present. Ethan walked back to his car with the same composed stride he had carried for years, understanding that success had not altered who he was. It had simply revealed him clearly enough that others could no longer misread the outline. By the time Ethan returned to his condominium that afternoon, the conversation at the waterfront restaurant had settled into something steady inside him. Not excitement, not relief, but alignment. He placed his keys on the entry table and removed his jacket with the same measured movements he carried into every decision. His phone buzzed again, this time with a call rather than a message. The name Caleb Morris appeared on the screen. Caleb had been there from the beginning, from the first rented office with exposed wiring and secondhand chairs. Ethan answered without hesitation. "So it is official?" Caleb asked, his voice bright with restrained energy. "It is official," Ethan replied. There was no dramatic pause, no celebratory shout. Just confirmation. Caleb exhaled audibly. 6 years, he said. 6 years of being told we were too early. Ethan allowed a small smile to surface. "We were not early," he said. "We were patient." He walked toward his home office, glancing at the whiteboard that still held. Faint outlines of system architecture drawn months ago. Caleb continued, shifting from reflection to logistics. The transition team wants to finalize your advisory schedule next week. Also, the press release draft is ready if you want to review it. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Keep the release straightforward, he said. No exaggerated language. Focus on the product impact. Caleb laughed lightly. You close a deal of this size and still talk like an engineer. Ethan did not respond immediately. He had never been interested in headlines. He had been interested in efficiency, in problem solving, in measurable outcomes. The scale of the acquisition did not alter that instinct. After the call ended, Ethan opened his laptop and reviewed the draft announcement. His name appeared in bold near the top. Founder and Chief Executive Officer. The phrasing felt factual rather than symbolic. He remembered the early meetings when investors had scanned his resume and hesitated at the absence of elite corporate titles. He remembered leaving conference rooms with polite handshakes and thin smiles, then returning to the office to refine the platform rather than defend it. Outside his window, late afternoon lights stretched across the buildings. The city moved forward without pause, delivery trucks unloading, commuters boarding trains. His phone chimed again. A message from Lucas this time. I have been thinking about what you said. About clarity. I do not think I understood what that required. Ethan read the message slowly. The shift in tone was unmistakable. Lucas, who once measured worth in annual bonuses and visible wins, was beginning to examine the quieter metrics. Ethan typed a short reply. It required consistency more than confidence. He set the phone down and stood, walking toward the window. Reflection did not bring resentment. It brought perspective. The label that had followed him through childhood had not disappeared because of a number on paper. It had dissolved because he had refused to internalize it. Success had not arrived as revenge. It had arrived as evidence. And evidence, when sustained over time, does not need to argue. It simply stands. In the quiet of his apartment, Ethan understood that recognition from others was a byproduct, not a foundation. The foundation had always been built in small increments, in code written line by line, in decisions made without applause. And that foundation no longer required validation to remain solid. The week unfolded with a steady rhythm that felt both familiar and subtly transformed. Ethan attended transition meetings with the acquiring firm, reviewing integration timelines and staffing projections with the same composed focus he had carried for years. In conference rooms overlooking Midtown Manhattan, executives nodded with respect when he spoke, not because of the recent acquisition alone, but because he understood every layer of the product they were absorbing. He answered questions without exaggeration, corrected assumptions without defensiveness, and declined suggestions that diluted the original architecture. His authority did not rely on volume. It relied on clarity. Late one afternoon, as he stepped out of a meeting, his phone buzzed again. A message from Diane appeared. I found your old notebooks in the attic. The ones filled with sketches and formulas. I kept them. Ethan paused in the hallway outside the elevator, reading the words carefully. He remembered those notebooks. Spiral-bound, edges worn, pages dense with diagrams drawn in pencil. As a teenager, he had guarded them quietly, aware that their contents might invite more teasing than encouragement. Diane's message continued. I should have asked more questions back then. Instead of assuming, he typed a brief response. Thank you for keeping them. That is enough. He did not attach judgment to the past. He understood now that recognition sometimes arrives late, shaped by hindsight rather than foresight. That evening, he returned to Stamford and walked along the waterfront near his building, hands in his coat pockets, the cool air steady against his face. Boats rocked gently in their slips. Streetlights reflected in the water like small, patient signals. He thought about the years when family gatherings felt like evaluations rather than conversations. The shift that had begun at Sunday dinner had not erased those memories, but it had reframed them. The label that once lingered in the background of every interaction no longer carried weight. It had been replaced by something quieter and more durable. His phone vibrated again, this time with a group message from Lucas and Richard. They were discussing a charity event in town, debating whether to sponsor a technology education initiative for local high school students. Richard asked Ethan's opinion directly. What programs actually create impact? The question was practical, but the invitation behind it was unmistakable. Ethan responded with detailed suggestions, outlining measurable outcomes and long-term mentorship structures rather than surface-level donations. Lucas replied quickly, That makes sense. We should structure it that way. The exchange was brief, but it carried a tone that had not existed before. Ethan looked out across the dark water and understood something fundamental. Respect had shifted from assumption to inquiry. He had not demanded it. He had built his way into it. The following morning, as he prepared for another advisory call, he glanced once at the framed photograph on his shelf, the one from years ago in the Whitmore backyard. He did not remove it. He did not replace it. It remained as a quiet marker of distance traveled. Growth had not changed the setting. It had changed the perspective. And as Ethan stepped into another day of measured decisions and deliberate action, he carried no need to prove anything further. The proof already existed, steady and self-contained, beyond comparison, beyond labels, beyond the noise that once defined him. 2 weeks after the dinner that altered the atmosphere in Westport, Ethan found himself back in his condominium office reviewing long-term plans that extended beyond the 12-month advisory period. The acquisition had stabilized. Integration teams were moving efficiently. Revenue projections were meeting expectations. Yet what occupied his thoughts was not the number attached to his name, but the direction that followed it. He had always measured success by utility rather than visibility. That standard had not changed. His phone rang just before noon. Richard's name appeared again. Ethan answered calmly. "I have been thinking about the education initiative," Richard said without preamble. "I would like you to lead it." There was no hesitation in his tone this time, no subtle hierarchy embedded in the request. Ethan leaned back in his chair, considering the weight of the invitation. "Lead it how?" he asked. "Structure it," Richard replied. "Define what actually matters. Not just a donation. Something measurable." The phrasing echoed Ethan's own language from the waterfront walk days earlier. It signaled listening rather than correction. Ethan nodded to himself, even though his father could not see the gesture. "Then it should focus on students who are underestimated," he said. "Those who do not fit conventional profiles, but demonstrate persistence." There was a brief pause on the line. "That sounds familiar," Richard replied quietly. Ethan did not respond with humor. He did not soften the implication. He simply continued outlining a scholarship framework tied to mentorship and internship. Pipelines rather than one-time grants. Richard listened carefully, asking clarifying questions instead of offering directives. When the call ended, Ethan remained still for a moment. The shift was no longer subtle. Authority had moved from assumption to acknowledgement. Later that afternoon, Lucas called as well. His tone carried less calculation than before. "I reviewed your proposal draft," he said. "It is solid, direct, efficient." Compliments from Lucas had once arrived wrapped in comparison. This one stood alone. "I used to think confidence was the loudest person in the room," Lucas admitted after a pause. "Now I think it might be the one who does not need to prove anything." Ethan allowed a small breath to escape, not a laugh, not disbelief, but recognition. "Confidence is consistency," he replied. "It compounds over time." Outside his window, the skyline reflected late afternoon light again, steady and unchanged. Inside, Ethan opened a new document titled Whitmore Technology Fellowship Initiative. The name felt balanced, not hierarchical. It included the family name, but did not center one son over the other. As he typed the first lines, he understood that the most meaningful shifts were rarely dramatic. They unfolded in conversations, in tone, in invitations to lead rather than follow. The label that once followed him had dissolved into context, no longer active, no longer defining. He had not erased the past. He had outgrown it. And in doing so, he had quietly redefined what competence looked like within the walls that once underestimated him. The Whitmore Technology Fellowship Initiative was announced on a clear Saturday morning in early November at the Community Center in Westport, a modest brick building with folding chairs arranged in neat rows and a podium set beneath a simple banner bearing the family name. There were no dramatic spotlights, no oversized checks for photographs, just a structured program outline projected onto a screen. Ethan stood slightly to the side as Richard introduced the initiative, his voice steady but noticeably less authoritative than in years past. When Richard described the program's purpose, he did not frame it as charity. He framed it as recognition of overlooked potential. Diane sat in the front row, hands folded in her lap, watching her younger son with an expression that carried both pride and reflection. Lucas stood near the back, arms relaxed at his sides, listening rather than leading. When it was Ethan's turn to speak, he stepped to the podium without flourish. He did not recount personal grievances. He did not dramatize his journey. He simply explained the structure of the fellowship. It would identify high school seniors who demonstrated persistence and unconventional problem-solving skills. It would pair them with mentors from engineering and data science fields. It would provide internships, not just scholarships, ensuring exposure to real projects measured in measurable outcomes. He spoke clearly, each sentence deliberate, free of exaggeration. The audience listened quietly, some taking notes, others nodding at the practicality of the design. After the presentation, a guidance counselor approached him. "Most programs reward the loudest achievers," she said. "This one feels different." Ethan nodded. "Potential is not always visible," he replied. "It is often consistent." As the event concluded, Richard placed a hand briefly on Ethan's back, not guiding him forward, not steering the narrative, but acknowledging his leadership. Diane stepped closer as well. "You built this with intention," she said softly. "Not just the company. This." Ethan met her gaze calmly. "Structure matters," he said. "So does patience." Lucas joined them moments later, offering a firm handshake rather than a competitive remark. "You were right about consistency," he said. "It compounds." The words echoed their earlier conversation, but this time they carried conviction. As the crowd dispersed, Ethan stepped outside into the crisp air, watching families gather in small groups on the sidewalk. The initiative would take months to implement fully. There would be applications to review, mentors to recruit, progress to measure. It would require discipline. That did not intimidate him. Discipline had always been his language. Inside the community center, Richard spoke with local business owners, referencing Ethan's framework rather than presenting his own. The shift was complete, not loud, not theatrical, but unmistakable. The narrative that once defined Ethan as secondary had been replaced by something grounded in evidence and respect. He had not forced the change. He had built toward it. And as he walked toward his car beneath the pale autumn sun, he understood that recognition earned quietly carries more permanence than approval granted casually. The label that once followed him had dissolved into memory, replaced by a role defined not by comparison, but by contribution. The weeks following the launch of the fellowship moved with a structured intensity that felt familiar to Ethan, though the context had changed. Applications began, arriving through the online portal he had personally overseen, each submission containing essays, project samples, and recommendation letters. He reviewed them late in the evenings from his condominium office in Stamford, the glow of his monitor reflecting softly against the window as trains passed in the distance. He did not skim. He read carefully, looking not for polished language but for evidence of persistence. One application stood out from a student in Bridgeport who had built a basic scheduling tool to help her family manage overlapping work shifts. The code was imperfect. The logic was thoughtful. Ethan made a note beside her name. Consistency over flash. He understood that pattern well. Meanwhile, the transition period at the acquiring firm continued smoothly. Ethan attended advisory sessions twice a week, offering technical guidance without seeking authority. In conference rooms lined with glass walls, younger engineers listened closely as he explained why certain design decisions had required patience rather than speed. He did not mention the years when patience had been mistaken for hesitation in his own home. He simply modeled the difference. One evening, Diane called unexpectedly. Her voice carried a softness that had grown steadier since the dinner that shifted everything. "I was thinking about your first job after college," she said. "You worked 2 positions at once. I told relatives you were still figuring things out." Ethan remembered that time clearly, balancing a contract coding role during the day with freelance development at night. "I was figuring things out," he replied calmly. That was the point. There was no accusation in his tone. Diane exhaled gently. "I confused exploration with uncertainty," she said. "I see that now." Ethan listened without rushing to reassure her. Understanding did not need immediate absolution. It needed acknowledgement. Across town in Westport, Richard had begun referencing Ethan's framework in conversations with other local business leaders, speaking less about immediate returns and more about long-term cultivation of talent. Lucas, too, had adjusted his approach, inviting Ethan to collaborative discussions without competitive undertones. The change was not theatrical. It was structural. That Friday evening, Ethan returned to Westport for a small family dinner, less formal than before, no crystal glasses, no reserved dining room. The four of them sat around the kitchen table instead. Conversation flowed without comparison. Richard asked about the student applications. Diane described organizing old photographs in the attic. Lucas discussed a project at his firm, but paused to ask Ethan's perspective rather than dominate the discussion. At one point, Richard looked across the table and said quietly, "I used to measure success by visibility. I was wrong." Ethan did not respond immediately. He set down his fork, meeting his father's gaze with steady composure. "Success is sustainable when it is built quietly," he said. The statement was not corrective. It was reflective. The evening ended without tension, without rehearsed apologies, without dramatic declarations. As Ethan drove back toward Stanford under a darkening sky, he understood that transformation rarely arrives in a single moment. It unfolds in conversations repeated, in tones softened, in questions asked differently. The label that once defined him had faded into irrelevance, not erased, but overshadowed by consistent evidence. And as the city lights came into view again, he felt no urgency to prove anything further. The foundation he built no longer required defense. It simply stood, steady and undeniable. The first round of fellowship interviews began on a gray Monday morning in December, conducted through video calls arranged in precise 30-minute blocks. Ethan sat at his desk in Stanford, a legal pad beside him filled with notes from each application he had read in detail. He did not search for charisma. He searched for evidence of resilience. The student from Bridgeport appeared on screen first, her posture straight despite a modest background visible behind her. She spoke about writing code at the kitchen table after her younger siblings went to bed, about testing programs on a refurbished laptop that overheated if pushed too far. She did not exaggerate her challenges. She described them plainly. Ethan asked careful questions about her debugging process, about how she responded when a solution failed. Her answers were not polished. They were thoughtful. After the call ended, he wrote a single word beside her name. Persistent. The interviews continued throughout the week. Some candidates spoke confidently, but struggled to explain their decision-making. Others hesitated in delivery, but demonstrated depth in reasoning. Ethan weighed each response carefully, refusing to let presentation overshadow substance. In Westport, Richard and Lucas waited for his evaluations before reviewing any names, a dynamic that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Diane stopped by the condominium one evening with a box of old notebooks she had found in the attic. She set them gently on Ethan's kitchen counter. Without ceremony. "I thought you might want these," she said. He opened the top notebook slowly, flipping through pages filled with teenage handwriting, circuit diagrams, and early attempts at algorithmic flow. Diane watched quietly. "I should have recognized what I was looking at," she said. Ethan closed the notebook and looked at her steadily. "You were looking at something unfamiliar," he replied. "It is harder to value what you do not understand." Diane nodded, accepting the truth of it without defensiveness. Later that week, the final fellowship candidates were selected. Ethan presented the list during a small meeting at the Westport Community Center. Richard reviewed the names without suggesting changes. Lucas asked about mentorship pairings, not outcomes tied to publicity. The focus remained structural. When the meeting concluded, Richard lingered for a moment. "You have a way of seeing potential before it is obvious," he said quietly. Ethan did not respond with modesty or pride. "It becomes obvious if you look long enough," he said. Outside, winter air had begun to settle across the town, crisp and steady. The transformation within the Whitmore family did not arrive as a dramatic apology or a public confession. It arrived through repetition, through new patterns of listening, through invitations extended without hierarchy. That evening, Ethan returned to Stanford and placed the old notebooks on his shelf beside current project binders. Past and present sat aligned, not in conflict, but in context. The boy who had once filled those pages with quiet calculations had not needed louder affirmation. He had needed time, and time, applied consistently, had revealed what labels never could. By mid-December, the first fellowship recipients were formally announced, their names posted quietly on the program website without spectacle or inflated headlines. Ethan insisted on personal phone calls rather than automated emails. One by one, he spoke with each student, offering not grand promises, but clear expectations. The student from Bridgeport answered on the second ring, her voice cautious at first, then steady as he explained the mentorship structure and internship placement beginning in the summer. She thanked him more than once. He redirected the gratitude toward her persistence. "You did the work," he said. "We are simply recognizing it." After the final call ended, Ethan sat back in his chair and allowed a brief pause to settle. Recognition felt different when it was extended thoughtfully rather than distributed broadly. Later, that week, the Whitmores gathered again in Westport, this time for a small holiday dinner in the kitchen rather than the formal dining room. The shift in location had become symbolic without anyone naming it. Diane prepared a simple meal, no elaborate table settings, no orchestrated presentation. Richard asked Ethan about the student's project interests, listening closely as he described plans for hands-on development work. Lucas offered to host one of the internship rotations at his firm, not as a favor, but as a structured contribution. The conversation moved without tension, without coded comparisons. At one point, Richard leaned back in his chair and looked at both of his sons. "I used to think success needed to be visible to be valid," he said. "I see now that some of the most durable things are built quietly." Ethan met his father's gaze without hesitation. "Visibility is optional," he replied. "Integrity is not." The words were not corrective. They were clarifying. Diane nodded slowly, absorbing the simplicity of it. After dinner, Ethan stepped outside onto the back patio for a moment alone. The winter air was sharp but calm, the backyard quiet beneath a pale sky. He remembered standing in that same yard years earlier, explaining a prototype idea while Richard redirected the conversation toward more stable career paths. The memory did not sting anymore. It simply existed as contrast. Inside the house, laughter drifted faintly through the window, not forced, not competitive. Ethan understood that transformation within a family does not erase history. It reframes it. When he returned inside, Lucas handed him a mug of coffee without comment. The gesture was small, unremarkable to an outsider, but significant in context. Later that night, as Ethan drove back toward Stamford, he reflected on the arc of the past months. The acquisition had triggered attention. The fellowship had redirected it toward purpose. The conversations that followed had reshaped dynamics built over decades. None of it required spectacle. It required consistency. As city lights came into view again, Ethan felt no need to revisit old narratives. They had been replaced, not by revenge or triumph, but by evidence sustained over time. And evidence, once established, does not argue. It simply stands, steady and clear, beyond comparison and beyond doubt.